Thank you, Larry. My uncle, Adam Coffey, I think there are some coffees here. Adam, he grew up, he lived, and he worked in the same small fishing village. He was a jovial man, and he was always interested in a bit of crack. Nobody laughed at that, which I'm amazed about. Because in Ireland, there is this word, crack, and it means to have fun. And it meant to have fun long before it became what it was in North America. And because of North America, they actually had to get a new spelling for the word, and so they put it into Irish. It's now C-R-A-I-C, crack. And as I said, it's a bit of fun. And people would go out on a Friday or a Saturday night for a bit of crack. Or people might go to one of their friends' homes for a cup of tea and a bit of crack. And there would be no illegal substances whatsoever. Well, Uncle Adam, however, he didn't need to go anywhere for crack. He just lived crack. He was a funny man. He told stories. He loved to play games, and he got up to all sorts of nonsense. I and several of my cousins had our first driving lessons under Adam's tutelage. I remember when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, he put me behind the wheel of his lorry, which in North American is truck. He put me behind the wheel of his truck, and it was down a wee country road where there was no other traffic to bother us, and Adam was just in his element, smiling away because his young nephew was driving, and I was feeling like the big man behind the wheel. Well, I liked Adam, but one night at my grandmother's house, Adam was telling a story when he appeared to choke, I was told, and he fell over in his chair, and he passed away. And as word spread throughout the family, we realized we had encountered death yet again. My Aunt Marianne, of course, was beside herself. Adam was gone. And even at a very young age, I realized, and I had the sense that this was it. There was no coming back. Adam was gone. Now, death is a part of the human condition. Sooner or later, we all encounter it. It's sometimes called the last or the greatest enemy, and almost from the beginning of time, human beings have wondered, they have questioned, they have speculated about what may lie beyond the pale. Some individuals in every generation have tried to defy it, to find some fountain of youth or the Holy Grail. But each in turn has had to come to grips with the inevitability of it, the finality of it. In the ancient world, it was thought that the dead went to the underworld and had a meager existence there. If you were with us a couple of Sundays ago, I spoke about views of the underworld in ancient Near Eastern society, and they all viewed it as sort of a dark, murky existence. There was no joy there. There was no light. There were no relationships. And there were regional differences between this culture and that culture about life after death. But there was one thing that they all held, every culture, that there was no coming back. They called it the land of no return. And there was one popular fertility myth that existed in several cultures about a fertility god going down to the netherworld in the winter and then coming up in the spring, and that sort of went on. It was a cyclical thing, and it went back and forth according to the cycles of nature. But there was no sense within, this was something different. There was no sense that this fertility god could come back and remain in the land of the living. No God, no human could ever come back once the bar was crossed. And so it's in that belief network, that belief context, that the events of Jesus' death occurred and were so difficult for the disciples and others to grasp. And if you read the accounts in the Gospels, you'll find that even the disciples really struggled with what had happened. Now, of course, the first ones to go to the empty tomb were Mary Magdalene and some of the other women who were associated with the disciples. And they went there to anoint the body, as was common Jewish burial practice. And if you read the Gospel of John, in John's account, the emphasis when Mary sees that this tomb is empty, the emphasis there is on Mary, her grief about missing the body. Not only had these people taken her Lord, but now someone had taken the body away, and she wasn't able to do what was their common burial practice with the body. And she's distraught, and she's crying, and through her tears, she sees this man, she assumes it's the gardener, and she says, "Have you taken away my Lord?" All normal sorts of emotions, normal sorts of expectations and reactions, until he spoke. This one she thought was the gardener, and he just said, "Mary." And right away, she was astonished and said, "Rabboni," my teacher. And Mark tells us, in the passage that was just read for us by Larry, Mark tells us that terror and amazement had seized them. And they went back to tell others. Terror and amazement had seized them. This was crazy. Dead people don't come back. Had that really been Jesus? And so they tell some of the closest disciples, and we hear in that gospel that they didn't believe them. Peter and another ran to the tomb to have a look, however, only to find it empty. They didn't believe. It was only later, when Jesus appeared to 10 of the disciples in a room, that they began to believe. They were dumbfounded. And Luke says that they thought they were seeing a ghost. And their worldview would have allowed for that kind of terminology. But this wasn't a ghost, because Jesus then asks them to put their hands in, or fingers in his hands and touch him, and says, well, a ghost does not have flesh and blood. And then Luke, in his gospel, he sort of continues this thought, and he says, in their joy about seeing Jesus, in their joy, they were disbelieving. Beyond belief. You probably know the story about Thomas. That's probably the quintessential story of doubt, doubting Thomas. But Jesus then came another week later or so and appeared to the disciples with Thomas in tow this time. There were other appearances, and others on the road to Emmaus in Galilee. And these appearances that the Gospels tell us about, Paul sort of talks about them, but Paul's talking about them 15 to 25 years before the Gospels were even reached their final form. So this is the first account. And Paul says, "For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day, and that he appeared to Cephas, then the 12, then to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. And then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me. Now think about it. It's an absolutely incredible claim. And it pushes our modern and educated and our mainline church minds to the limit. But if for a moment we could set aside some of the modernist assumptions and think about this, it might allow us to think about something unique, something beyond the natural. Now, I could ask you how we get knowledge of the past. And if you think about it, you would say it's from eyewitnesses, people who were there. Well, so if it had happened today, for instance, I forgot to bring my phone with me, but if it happened today, for instance, and Mary saw Jesus at the tomb, the person she thought it was a gardener, she would have pulled out her phone and maybe taken a selfie of her and Jesus. Maybe stand beside the egg tree and take a picture, or beside the empty tomb. Let's get a picture of us. But, she really didn't have that kind of technology available. When it comes to the distant past, when it comes to history, how do we know anything? It's through eyewitness reports. Archaeology can tell us something about it, but it's general in nature. We need eyewitness reports, somebody writing things down in order to put faces and names and emotions and things like that to what goes on in the past. And then we take these reports, and historians will tell us that not every report's of equal value, and they talk about differences in reports and things that are unclear, and they have to weigh the credibility of one witness versus another. But the broad rule is that the past comes to us from eyewitnesses. And when Paul, he tells the early Christians that Cephas, and then the 12, and then the 500, and then all the apostles, and then James, and then him, that they had seen the risen Lord, what he's saying is that don't just trust me, there are many others who have seen. And then we can begin to evaluate those and think about how correct they might be. And he says we can learn about these people and from biblical texts and other texts, and we learn they're ordinary human beings. Some of them are fishermen, some of them are tax collectors, some of them lived in villages and towns. They were real people, they're normal people, human beings who had good days and bad. And the 12, for instance, if you think about them, these people who were pillars of the church, later on, they are portrayed as people not quite getting Jesus, not quite getting his message, and they're depicted as sort of fighting among each other for the best seat in the house at times. When their teacher is in trouble, they flee, they run away. It's all pretty normal human stuff. But something happened. Something happened that completely and utterly altered their lives. And it took away their anxiety. Whereas at one point they couldn't stand up for Jesus, they stand up in front of people in the temple and proclaim Jesus as risen from death in very concrete terms. And you think, wow, what happened? I'm sure that many of you have come across friends and newspaper reports sort of suggesting that they're all having hallucinations, and or that in some spiritual sense they felt that Jesus' presence was with them, that they sensed that his cause was still going forward, and they should continue this cause in the world. But when you think about it, while that is possible, you have to ask yourself, is it plausible? While it's possible, is it plausible? Is it plausible that a group of people who kept emphasizing love and righteousness and honesty would be telling us something that wasn't true? Is it plausible that this ordinary group of people who are fearful suddenly change and they're willing to expend themselves and undergo hardship and persecution and even martyrdom at times for something they knew wasn't true? Or is there some other explanation? Isn't it more likely that something so rocked their worlds that they couldn't do anything else? So altered things, something so great, so amazing, that it just changed them forever? You think about the Apostle Paul. Here he is. He's a guy, he tells us, who was a Jew. He had gone into Jerusalem to learn under one of the greatest rabbis, Gamaliel. He had been invited by the priests to, when this sect called Christians grew up, he had been invited to persecute them. And he talks about how he would round them up, how he would persecute them, how even was around when they were put to death. And yet, something happened that completely turned Paul right around to where he became a Christian himself, stood up for Jesus. A dream or an encounter? And Paul became he was so into this new thing, so moved by Christ, that he indicates then that he underwent all sorts of hardship, all sorts of things. He had sleepless nights, went without food. He was outside in the cold and the elements. He was shipwrecked. He was stoned because of it. And what was this for? Something he wasn't sure about? Or something he was sure about? There's an old television commercial. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I think it was an old Minute Maid commercial, orange juice, done by Bing Crosby years and years ago. And in that commercial, Bing Crosby's talking about this Minute Maid orange juice, 100% Florida orange juice. And the juice of juices, the best of the best, he says, and there's no doubt about it. And I think what Paul would say is this. We all know that dead people don't come back to life, but sometimes you experience stuff that you just can't explain, and incredible as it may be, Peter saw him, James saw him, the apostles saw him, 500 people saw him. Inexplicable as it may be, there's no doubt about it. And it's in that certainty and in that hope that the church was born. And that's been talked about and it's been sung about for centuries. We sing about it even today. Christ the Lord is risen today. Our United Church Creed talks about it. Talks about Jesus Christ crucified and risen. And if we can just get this into our heads, if we can get the reality of the resurrection into our minds, it will change everything for us. It will show us that God has power. Power over things we don't expect. It will point to God setting the prisoner free from the underworld, the land of no return. It will give us hope that there's more to life than this. It will give us peace in all things, even in grief, because we know that there's more to life than this. Death is not the end. It'll encourage us, even in difficult days, because we know there's more. The resurrection. Plausible. Maybe more.